Hi, I'm Lisa Anderson, president of LMA Consulting Group and host of Supply Chain Chats. And I'm thrilled to be here today with Art Beeman and Joel Muchmore of Beeman and Muchmore. So I'm excited to be with them today. We're going to talk about ERP, software licensing, and related topics. So let's start with maybe Joel and/or Art. You could give us a brief overview of you and/or your company.
Yeah, of course. Art, if you don't mind that I start. Joel Muchmore, one of the founding partners of Beeman and Muchmore. We are a small boutique firm that specializes almost exclusively in software licensing, by which we mean compliance, procurement, defense, all of the kind of micro issues that are embedded in the very large issue of how to license software, stay compliant, and get out of your vendor's radar so that you can basically do the work that you're supposed to do. And a little self-congratulation, we are 5 years now. We are big law expats, and we just celebrated our 5-year anniversary at the beginning of June. So it's an exciting time for us.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
And I am Art Beeman, the other founding partner of Beeman and Muchmore. And as Joel just referenced, we came to form our firm now a couple months over 5 years ago. And we came with a perspective of providing specialized counseling with the experience and insights we gained as litigators for many, many decades.
Awesome. Well, and I think that this topic is of importance to our client base in terms of manufacturing and supply chain type organizations, as every manufacturer has to have an ERP system, at least if they plan to grow and be successful. And it's become a real rat's nest, if you will, in terms of how to navigate that process. We focus a bit on ERP selection and all of our clients are looking to utilize their ERP system and other systems, because these days clients have an abundance of systems between CRM, sales forecasting. I could go on and name them all, but there's so many systems and technologies that are necessary if you want to be profitable and grow your company successfully. So I think this is a real hot topic, and it's not just in purchasing the software you should be thinking about this, but also maintaining the software so that you can, unfortunately, keep yourself out of trouble. So with that said, I will turn it over to you all to start the topic here on why should we care about software licensing, or tell us what you think.
Well, of course. And, what you say about it becoming a rat's nest, I just think is so true. We've been doing this, again, in our own firm for 5 years, but many years before that. And it's just getting more complicated all the time, as we have people going into cloud offerings, hybrid cloud offerings. We have SaaS models, even looking at, for example, Oracle supply chain management software that is available as a SaaS model. It is available for a hard, bare metal installment model. They have different ways of licensing each of those. And as I think the word is getting out on the street, Oracle has always been aggressive about this kind of compliance. Broadcom is getting more and more aggressive. We have Salesforce, everybody. Auditing, compliance is becoming a major arm of all of the software vendors. And what we do and what we advise everybody to do is be very careful. And I think it's fair to break it into two kinds of categories. It sounds very simple, but they're each equally important. You think about procurement. When you purchase your license, are you compliant? Are you compliant the moment that you purchase it? Are you compliant as your business grows, as your dollar value, as your units processed, as the size of your company grows? Are you prepared for that? And then the flip side of that is what we call defense or compliance. What happens when your vendor comes sniffing around and ensuring that you are where you're supposed to be? There are many ways to botch both of those and turn a good or a decent situation into a very bad situation. And so that's a lot of what we like to advise, either informally or formally, is you got to be careful on intake, and you got to be careful when somebody is sniffing around trying to increase their revenue from you, and not give away the farm, not say too much, be careful, hold your cards close, but while always being compliant. Art, do you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with you. And I just thought we could just take a step back for a second. You use two key words, compliant and compliance and audit. And just to focus in when the folks out there hear you talking about compliance and audit, obviously everyone has their experiences involving the IRS and audit there. But when we're talking about an audit in this space, what are you talking about?
Well, it breaks down into two basic things. I think that what we were accustomed to doing for many years, we would call the formal contractual audit. Your vendor has a provision inside of your license agreement, which gives it the right to come poke around under the hood, perhaps run scripts, perhaps ask for self-reporting to talk about how you have things deployed, how you're using it, what your counts are. That's a formal process. When the audit note comes in, you're aware of it, you know what to do, perhaps legal gets involved, you kind of circle the wagons and put your best foot forward. And that's one scenario, and that is one that we get involved in a lot, oftentimes at the beginning, because again, everybody knows what's happening. But what we're seeing more and more, which I think is even more pernicious, we call the soft audit. And that is when you have somebody, I've used this phrase before, but it's so visceral to me, come sniffing around from your vendor, and they guise it as a sales call. We've noticed some downloads where there's some changes coming in, and they kind of sneak in through the back door and just start asking a lot of questions. And oftentimes, because in our experience, IT departments like to be compliant. They are proud of their environments and they start proffering information, but no one's really observing that. Nobody's really being careful about it. And then once your vendor pulls all this information in, they start making radical, sometimes abusive allegations of over-deployment, under-licensing. And by that point, the cat's out of the bag and you're playing defense before you even knew that there was a game afoot.
What we're really seeing and makes this particular sector of the economy and our practice as it relates to the sector so fascinating and at the same time so challenging is the intersection of technology with law. And the law here is triggered by contracts, or as we say here, licensing agreements. And often these license agreements have been drafted many years ago. And terms meant what they meant back when the technology was what it was. Years ago, the contract terms are static, too often at least they are. And then technology just continues its relentless march forward, and then a dispute surfaces. And then the parties are going back to the contract, and they are literally trying to extract meaning and construction and rights and obligations from terms in a contract. Sometimes, Joel, I think we've seen contracts that were forged in the 1990s.
Oh, yes.
Wow. All you have to do now to make something look ancient is let 3 or 4 years go by in the technology world. But here, sometimes are dealing with decades separating the forging of the contract with the dispute involving the technology. And Joel, you had several matters involving virtualization and how that technology came in and mixed everything up. Can you give a little background on what virtualization is and how it's become such a conundrum in the market?
Absolutely, and that is a key example. So go back to what you state. Almost all license agreements start with a foundational agreement. So that is your master agreement that if you're Oracle, it's the Oracle Master Agreement or the Software License and Services Agreement, or for Broadcom, it's a comparable one. And so they have they were drafted around installing on bare metal. There was no cloud and there was no virtualization technology, which is the creation of pseudo desktop environments inside of your bare metal. So you have what essentially operates as multiple different computers all within one framework. So you can have the same number of installations, but you have multiple portals, multiple end users all plugged in. So what does that mean for the contract? Does that mean that do these technologies, which allow for the seamless shifting of this technology from multiple installations within this one environment, does that change the impact? Well, if you talk to most vendors, they say it does. In fact, they say it does dramatically. Do the contracts speak to this? Well, almost never. I hate to say never, but almost never. So what you have is this back and forth between the licensee and the vendor, where the vendor is ferreting out language from it and then trying to apply it. It's the square peg in the round hole, and then there's a lot of back and forth. But, and Art, I'm sure you've seen this too, that also brings in the intersection of what we call non-contractual information. So you have policy documents, you have statements, you have white papers or other documents such as that being created by the vendor, which are not necessarily contractual, but they wield them as if they were contractual. And if you are an IT person on the other end and you say, where's this in the contract? And then the vendor says, well, we wrote something up about that recently. Here's what our policy is. And so all of a sudden you have multiple different vertices, multiple different kinds of documents, and it can be hard to ferret them out. They all seem equally important, but you go back to your foundation, Art. And I like what you said at the beginning, Art, about how it is a contract. It's a complicated contract. It can bring in multiple things, but at the very basis, you still have to ask that fundamental question. Is what they're trying to enforce a contract, or is it a wish list? Is it what they wish was in the contract, and they came in 25 years later and wrote up how they think it should be, and your responsibility is to pull back and say, you get your contract rights, everybody wants to be compliant, but you don't get to, after the fact, start trying to enforce something that was never intended and could not possibly be part of the contract.
And Joel, what you're really demonstrating here by your description of the scenario is the reality of the imbalance in power between a vendor and your typical customer. The vendor comes in and it's their technology, so that gives you a leverage point. They have the history behind the contract. Often they've drafted the contract. They're dealing with turnover in IT departments and people who want to keep their jobs and not create controversy. And so they become, in a sense, through these non-legal mechanisms of audits. And by non-legal, I mean you're not in court. It's just two parties, if you will, ferreting out their rights and trying to figure out what to do to resolve any potential dispute. But they're coming in with the experience because they've likely done or had these sorts of encounters with customers before. And Joel's earlier point is, well, they can't go as far necessarily as inserting terms into the contract, but they can talk about what should be wholly irrelevant things like policy. It's not in the contract, but it's policy, which in the world of contracts isn't worth the paper it's written on, because the contract is what defines, the license agreement is what defines the rights and obligations between the parties. But the vendor is more than happy to bring in things such as policies and practices, and they leverage their position because they're doing their business, which is to make money from their license agreements and their technology. And there's nothing wrong with that, obviously, but that is not necessarily congruent with the customer's interest, because what does the customer want to do? Continue in business and doing their thing and making their widgets or whatever is the source of their enterprise. And the natural inclination of so many customers is just to get it behind us, get it behind us. And that's one problem in terms of paying too much in the event of, as Joel described it, a soft audit. But even worse, in many ways, it can lead to agreements or, if you will, conduct which suffuses the contract that works against your interests going forward. Then all of a sudden you've cut a deal and you've demonstrated a particular perspective and course of conduct, and it haunts you 2 years later when they're coming back for more. And Joel, what is this really the aspect of our practice that you would call the prophylactic counseling that we give? Because at the end of the day, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, to descend into a cliche here. But it's absolutely the case with this practice. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely agree with that. And when you're doing that, the prophylactic, the trying to put in place what the prevention is, there are several issues. I'm getting a little more detailed here, a little more specific, but that should always be looked out for, that don't leap off the page, and trust that your vendor is not necessarily looking at these when they're trying to sell you the contract. So here are some that I like to think about. Subsidiaries. All companies are getting increasingly complicated. Your average agreement in this day and age is going to allow the signing party to use the software. Well, your signing party might be at the top of the chain. It might be down lower on the bottom of the chain. It might merely be a procurement entity that does nothing more than sign these agreements. However, when you trace that through the agreement, who has the right to use the software? And oftentimes you need to go in specifically on the front end and negotiate, whether it's affiliates, whether it's enumerated affiliates, whether it's all subsidiaries, but just to make sure that every related entity that is either using the software or having it used on behalf of another entity is included in the rights to use it. And this seems like a very basic thing, but trust, we've seen nearly all vendors do not hesitate to come roaring in and say, oh, well, look, the only one entity has the right to use this. It wasn't our responsibility to be sure that all of your 17 subsidiaries are included. So here is another contract that costs 17 times as much money because you have that many more entities using it. That's the kind of thing that can be hard to back out of, but when you're seasoned, you can start looking for it just to be sure that you're protected. Another similar one is territories. You can have the right to use, and oftentimes it delineates where you can use it, whether it's in the US or it's US and Canada or it's worldwide. Oftentimes there's not a lot of thought given to that on the front end, but if you have your data, once again, either being used by other entities or even deployed offshores, that can be an absolute violation of the terms. And once again, they're not looking out for you on the intake, but they will absolutely come around. Let's take that soft audit example and say, oh, so where do you have this stuff installed? Where are your primary servers? And somebody says, well, we took advantage of some of the cheaper abilities to have some of it done out of Ireland and some out of India, and we're just one big happy family. And the next thing you know, you have your vendor saying, breach, breach, breach. You have the right to deploy it in one place. You've deployed it elsewhere. And so we need a new contract, and it's going to be a lot more expensive.
Well, go ahead,
Lisa, please.
I was just going to say that I think that, all of this can add up to be quite significant. So it sounds to me like one of the keys is making sure, if you have the opportunity, to look at it ahead of time so that you can avoid a lot of these issues. However, a lot of folks are probably in the situation, whatever the situation they are in, they're already in it. So if nothing else, it sounds like they should get a review to figure out their best path forward, because they have to be on top of this topic, it sounds like.
Lisa, you make such an important point, and I know we couldn't agree with you more. The issues sometimes going into, let's say, an encounter, if not confrontation with a vendor, we have clients who cannot retrieve the necessary contractual documents. And we're not being critical here because, again, the clients are in the business that they're in. But the challenge sometimes is just the fundamental house cleaning of knowing what constitutes the four corners of the contract. And sometimes in the initial review, before even necessarily a collision with a vendor, our clients ask us to do exactly that. We have, especially with things digitized and now trying to, if you will, mesh it together, almost like putting together one of those table big crossword puzzles. And it's like, well, where does this piece go? Well, until we get the borders, we won't know. That sort of thing. And that is the due diligence. Find out what constitutes the contract. There's a certain methodology there. You talk to the necessary people. And then you know the fortification that you're going to go into any conflict with. What you don't want is to have that conflict surface. They're pushing back on you, and you don't know what the contract exactly is. That's not what I would call an empowered position to be in.
Well, I mean, this is a good and timely topic, really, because as companies are moving to the future, artificial intelligence is coming into effect. There's more and more needs for different softwares, and they're going to be adding on software licenses. So before you do so, make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into so that you can set it up as best as possible for your company.
Exactly.
Sounds like. Very good. Is there any last thoughts you have? Or, I mean, you've already provided substantial details, so that's awesome for our listeners here.
Well, just to summarize the last bit of the conversation, the best thing to do is to be attentive on intake, but the second best thing to do is to do some amount of a self-audit, a self-deployment report. Just be aware. It's never too late to clean up your shop, even if you didn't give it the attention that you might in retrospect have wished you had. Never too late to clean up your shop and to take care of yourself going forward.
You know, that's exactly how it is in the manufacturing environment as well, for your inventory, for all sorts of topics. So, you know, certainly do it up front for the future, but I would wholeheartedly agree. You need to know where you stand and clean up in the meantime so that you're prepared for supporting your growth.
Exactly.
All right. Well, very good. Well, thank you very much. Art and Joel, I appreciate you being on Supply Chain Chats today and providing us with some tips on software licensing.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.